we might just go ahead and kick things off. We got these two handsome gentlemen that we got up on the screen here. We're going to kick things off with a little bit of like introduction, right? I don't know what all this stuff is over here, but we got some introductions. We're going to talk a little bit about who we are, and then we're going to get into the world of productized services, which is going to be really fun. We have a Q&A as per usual. So we're aiming to talk for, I don't know, call it a half an hour, which is a good chunk of listening time. And then we'll open things up to Q&A. So feel free to jump in and ask questions. We have the chat going. Our colleague Caitlin is watching that on our behalf. So if anything comes up, you got technical issues, you can't get in, and we're talking about a piece of content or something that you really want to get your mitts on, be sure to ask and we can go ahead and track that down and pull copies for it, stuff like that. You never know. Or while we are very scripted, Grant and I have been rehearsing this webinar for days. Everything is buttoned up, well-oiled machine. We might, a conversation might take us into some fun places. So feel free to ask questions in the chat. We also have the Q&A feature going up. So we will either answer some of those questions if they're relevant to what we're talking about right then. I'll pop in, pull that question up, and we'll talk about it. Or we will try and get to them at the end. We typically collect all those questions and we'll still respond to you in time just to make sure that you do get your answers or questions answered. So Grant, you're my guest today, whether that's good or bad. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what your experience is, and why you're here with me on this webinar.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm really appreciative to be here. My journey with Parallax started, I think, over 4 years ago. I was talking to our founder, Tom O'Neill, about this, and the first company that I was with where we brought in Parallax was one of the first companies within a year of Parallax being founded. So, that journey started on the customer side, not just once on the digital service side, but actually in another company as well on the consulting side. And more recently, within the last 6 months, I've joined as an operational specialist for the organization. And I support the CS team in Austin and our great implementation and loyalty specialists that are here. But I also work with our sales team and our marketing team and the product team. And so it's been a really fun role to work with just really talented folks here at the organization and align not just our product, but also operations that come with that and from an agency basis. And so this productized services element, I haven't been a salesperson, but it's something I feel really strongly about because my background's been delivery. So I'm just, very appreciative to be here and looking forward to diving in.
Yeah. Welcome to the party, Grant. I had the pleasure of getting to try and recruit Grant to Parallax, which is really fun. I don't know if you've experienced this in your career, but getting to be on the side of like convincing someone to come join your team because of how great they are is a really fun position to be in. Because Grant, if you haven't had the chance to work with them, I know we have some customers on the call today. If you haven't had the chance to work with him, I hope you do get to in the near future because, he's really smart, really communicative. He knows this industry really well. He has a really wide breadth of experience and is aligned really nicely with like our point of view and how we feel that these businesses should operate, right? Like if you had a chance to work with me directly or you interacted with Parallax over time, like our point of view is very much like these businesses, like the way you run them, the way you operate them is not something we need to reinvent. We don't need to rebuild, create, new ways of doing these things. That energy goes towards, honing your craft and, packaging up what it is that you do in a really effective way. And that's going to be the topic of our conversation today with these productized services. So we're going to talk a lot about what they are. Just, I'm going to spend a few minutes at the top covering that. And then we're going to get into talking about, like, I get to grill Grant as my guest on like, his experience doing it at his old company. We'll kind of, ping pong back and forth as we talk through that. Thank you, Grant. So in the creation of this theme, when Grant and I were sitting down and talking early about, well, what are we going to talk about with productized services? We're going to, came up pretty quickly what I have on the screen right now, this idea that like everything we do is custom, every problem we go to solve is unique, every client a snowflake, like nothing is ever the same, everything is bespoke, and we hear it all the time. And we're going to do our best today to challenge that notion a little bit, like, or harness it. Like I don't disagree that like, yeah, problems are different. Your clients are different. The time of year that you meet that client, their situation, their maturity, all those things are true. And there are a lot of variables within the work that we do, but the way that we approach the problem, the way that we do the thing that makes us unique is something that is packageable, it is repeatable. And when you can find that for yourselves, you unlock a lot of unique benefits that help agencies grow and scale quickly. So, and effectively. Grant, I'm curious, like you, I think started out here, right? Like we all kind of start here. Like, how did it change for you early on?
Well, it changed with a lot of time, effort, and I think with experience, right? And that's a huge factor here. I mean, you led with it, Austin, saying we don't need to reinvent the wheel every time. And yet there is something I think to be said for learned experience. And what we're going to be getting into is, yeah, I mean, every customer that we work with on the agency side, right? Their problem is unique to them and they want to be spoken to and they do want to be understood as why that problem has value to them and what the solution could look like. And we've got to cater to that. There's no doubt about it. But the important factor is as much as that's part of a sales process or an account process, right? If you're going through a renewal, the rationalization has to be that we can control as an agency our approaches. And by doing so, we can actually set our teams up for success and we can baseline. And that baseline can have varying degrees of change as we hone in on that problem, as we learn more, as we get going. But that's where you can almost, the duality of having, yes, we can have the snowflake and we can have a common approach. But you do have to, that's got to be communicated throughout the organization. There's got to be some steps to be taken. And I'm looking forward to diving in there, but I don't, this was very common to us. We're a custom dev shop. We supported mobile, .NET, WordPress, design, UX, you name it, right? And yet you've got to find commonalities within your own delivery as you scale, as you grow, and as you support different customers and portfolios of work.
So, Grant's hitting on it right now perfectly. Script nailed it, Grant. Like we're using. When we talk about productized offerings, sometimes you'll hear like our nomenclature slip into this a little bit of parallax, but like, it doesn't really matter. The idea here is that, there are, whether you realize it or not, like there are predefined ways that you go about solving these problems. You might not have it formalized and packaged in these things, but that's what we're talking about. Like we're going to use this example as we go through the conversation today, but like a really good example is like the discovery session that probably everyone on this call runs in some form or another with a new customer, right? That is a packaged offering. It's the closest thing you have probably to a productized service if you realize it or not. Because what's fun about it is it's like, you know, it's a set timeline or it's a set amount of effort. We know how much we're going to charge for it. It's really easy to go in and talk to our client about it. Any one of my salespeople can pick up that package of a discovery session and walk into any one of my prospects and confidently explain why we start with a discovery and what the value is of doing so. It's about taking that idea, that concept, and applying it to everything else that we do if we can. We leverage SPI a lot for their industry research. It's really comprehensive and they do a fantastic job of capturing the differences really between like maturity levels in these businesses, right? And, we are invested heavily in like trying to help these companies run their operations in like the, universally effective way, right? Like we said at the top, like we're not here to reinvent these practices. And there's a huge standout between companies that are, reaching their goals in particular on like utilization and project margin, and they're seeing the revenue growth. And, you might have at some point or another just accepted the fact that agency life has this like sine wave to it, right? There's these really great peaks and these really devastating lows, and you're just going to alternate between those in perpetuity. That's what we've signed up for, right? That's the game we've signed up to play running these types of businesses. And organizations, though, that can productize what they do That type of stuff doesn't happen as much. It's easier to predict. You know what you're getting when you're going to market with it. It's easier to sell. You can get ahead of these things. So 80% of these companies that are doing really well are using, or like 80% of their revenue is coming from these productized, repeatable, scalable service offerings.
And I think
Uh,
there's a good
yeah.
break there, Austin, because we've got a first poll, I think, related to this, and we
Oh
may
yeah.
give it away a little bit, but you'll see that come through, and we'll kind of use some of that information as we go along.
Great point. I'm missing my cues now.
That's why I'm here.
While that's rolling, let's get into talk about, where what the benefits are. Like it's easy for me to go in and say like, look, great companies do this. Like, why don't you? But let's talk about the sort of the detail within it. That standardization is typically pretty common, like easily to understand, right? Like everyone knows what we're doing. We know what we're selling. Grant has used this phrase or like he talked to me before about like these productized services can act as the bridge between sales and delivery, right? Like Grant and I are both delivery side operations people. So we've had, developed our relationship with sales. We both agree that like it's best when it's symbiotic, right? Like there's no animosity between sales and delivery. We got to work together here because like our survival depends on it. Scalability then follows, right? Like you can replicate what you're doing across different clients. You can bring new people into the organization easier. You can, train new people. It becomes a lot simpler for you to, you know, ensure that the outcomes that you're trying to drive with your customers become possible, right? It's not a different game every single time you're stepping up to the plate. The predictability follows. You know generally what you're going to get. You can anticipate your pipeline a little bit better because you know generally what people are going to, or like how you're going to go forward with what it is that you're selling. And the where it starts to get really, I think, important, like where things really change, because like standardization, scalability, predictable revenue, those are great operational habits. They're great operational outcomes that are going to have real tangible value on the business, right? You're going to see project margins get better and utilization go up and things like that. The stuff that really like hits on the way you measure the quality of your operations. But where what we want to talk a lot about today is like how what makes you unique, right, is not your utilization numbers or your project margins. What makes you unique is your market differentiation, right? How do you approach problems different from your customer or your competitors? You need to be able to go to bat every time and be able to convince your prospects that like, hey, the way that we solve problems is better than the way that these other people solve problems. And here's why it's going to make a lot more sense for you to come work with us rather than them. Everyone at the company needs to understand that these service offerings are built with that in mind. What that does is that opens up then better marketing, better sales. Like you can build a sales team, an engine that everyone can learn these things and they can jump in and they can start to speak the same way. They can pitch more effectively. Like there's probably a lot of us in this room who've gone through the process of like hiring the, you know, big time salesperson who has done this and hey, this person's coming from Digitas, like, oh, they grew $1 billion in business. Like they're going to do wonderful things for my company, but they have a hard time selling anything because that's not their voice. Like they don't quite understand yet how to sell and pitch and market your value. And then again, like the final thing is like you can that focus on value, that delivery of the right outcomes to your clients, that delivery of what it is that they're looking for just becomes a lot easier when again everyone's on the same page and what you have a systemized approach to how you tackle problems. I'm monologuing a little bit, Grant. You want to talk us through these results on our poll here?
Yeah, I mean, I think to the point that you just mentioned here on these benefits, it's really clear, at least the group that we've got on the webinar today, you're already doing some of this, right? You recognize that value of saying, I can't, eat this whole elephant of a project, but the bites I can take right now are discovery and launch procedures, right? And how common is that, right? We go into discovery and we say, we're going to use this as a basis to understand the meat of the deliverables that we're going to get after within this project. And we can often upsell during that time. We can borrow time to make sure we've got the right skill set of the team, right? If they're not available quite yet. All things that Parallax helps us sort of recognize, but like that discovery operational procedure is a productized service that we can pitch and sell and bring to our customers to help drive not just our value, but determine too that they're going to get a better value by following this procedure and process. The other part of it too is launch, right? Because we want a certain expectation. And so we bookend, right, our typical project. And now the goal, I think, even too, is what we often hear still, and I would challenge anybody who's not doing it, but look at that middle territory and we'll get into how we can make it more feasible and predictable to look at that work as it progresses based off of the information we know that maybe we haven't completed discovery yet, but we're going to get there, right? And let's start informing our team so that we can start setting expectations internally and align around those. I love that people are using the retainer-based models too. We're big believers in duration-based planning, task-based planning, especially I think post-COVID. We're just aware that like that context switching can lead to burnout pretty quickly. And so doing more duration-based, I mean, that is the same, it can take a different operational procedure to ensure that we're delivering value during a retainer. And yet it enables, I think, our teams to really take that productized service that's been sold through, determine that value, deliver on a consistent basis, and win over clients even more.
We use the slide all the time. We use it in onboarding, we use it in sales and marketing because it really tells the story, I think, incredibly well. There are a lot of measurements that you can take along the way to understand how efficiently, right, you're converting your people's time into revenue, the underlying basis of, is the business healthy or not, right? We use utilization and project margin for that all the time. We're not going to talk about that necessarily today. Obviously, what we're advocating on the behalf for is like using these productized services makes it easier for you to get better utilization. It makes it easier for you to plan people's time. It makes it easier for you to make sure that you're selling things at the right rate, to make sure that you're making the right margin on these projects. Like that is a given. When we talk to a lot of our customers about growth and what that means, like everyone's got a slightly different definition for it. Growth can mean, well, we want to get to 85% utilization. Growth can mean, it's development of our people. It's making sure that we continue to offer really strong capability to the market, and we want to find stability and so forth. And that's what I want to talk about today. Like the growth within, the operations is something like that we are really passionate about at Parallax, right? Like we can help with the operational growth so that you have time to focus on the innovative growth, the stuff that makes you unique. Again, like we're going to start to sound like a broken record here after a little while, but that's what these productized services are designed to do. So I want to talk a little bit about this McKinsey Three Horizons model, and then we're going to move on to Grill and Grant on his history. The we love this model. We talk about it all the time. Tom, this is how he sold me early on, as when he came into my office for the first time when I was a customer, and he, you know, drew this up on the whiteboard. I think I probably still have a picture of it somewhere. What we are talking about here is like there's, Horizon One is like the stuff that makes you money right now, right? Like this is like the foundational profit center of your business. It's the stuff that you do really well. You're really efficient in it. You are, you can do it more effectively than your competitors. You can price it appropriately, and you can continue to make, it's the profit center of your business. I don't know why I'm belaboring it. And the second horizon here is the operational growth. It's like, okay, cool. Like, how are you expanding then within that area? This to me is what we're talking a lot about with productized services, right? Like when you can be repeatable, you can be, what was the other phrase I use? Like standardized, scalable, predictable. It's really helping you in that first horizon, that foundational area, right? Like you can make sure that you are generating the right amount of money to continue investing in the business. It also allows you to grow, right? You get that market differentiation. It's easier for your sales and marketing teams to continue to grow and expand. That's where we're talking about Horizon 2 here. And when you have those two things locked down, it opens up this third horizon, this like starting to drill into what like could be. You know what I mean? Like future ideas where, the strategic growth of the business, like the strategic evolution of what it is that you can offer your clients. Like the way that the graph is meant, like what it's meant to symbolize is like these three things and should be happening in concert, right? They're not meant to be like one, then the other, then the next. They should all be happening because you're going to earn your highest profitability on the new things like Horizon 2 and Horizon 3, right? Places where you're differentiated the most. Like if imagine if you're new to AI as an example, right? Like that's the hot topic today. You can charge $300-400 an hour for the work that you do because it's new and no one has the skills yet. Everyone's like throwing cash at the problem and your profitability can be the highest. As you reach like competitiveness, right? More people enter the market, more people start seeing the way that you do things. You get more copycats, more, more pressure. Your, the price starts to come down, right? Like how many of us, are working in industries right now where we used to be able to charge $200 an hour, and now we're charging $150 an hour because we're competing overseas for talent and all sorts of things. Like that's a perfect example of what model is meant to communicate. So that repeatability, that packaging of what you do helps you gain the foundation here. Again, the operational efficiency so that your team can continue to scale and sell out, smooth out those ups and downs that you typically see, that sine wave, while you then turn you take your best people and you turn them on to, the third horizon, like what's new, what's next, what's going to keep this business relevant into, 5-10 years from now. Use that to pause the break to take a sip of water here.
When I
All
think
right.
to that point too, right, before we dive into the kind of questions and banter back and forth, there's one more poll coming, so just be prepped for that. But I think as you orient around productized services and think about where they lie, try applying them to your own business of, what is the bread and butter, right? What is the thing that you can napkin out, after a day of work, say, oh yeah, that project, I got it. Like those are really great places to start. And we'll start demonstrating, I think, the horizons within your own organization.
Okay, well, I'm gonna kill his presentation because I don't think we need it anymore. But not thank you yet. We're not done. Yeah, there it is. There's our little poll. So like what we want to understand is who feels confident that you like have them, or have you been hesitant to applying this into your org? I know we talked a lot about people have, discoveries and things like that in play already, but Grant, you and I have seen a lot of this already. I feel like we've both seen a lot of hesitation to apply productized services into organizations. Often it is seen as a like, well, we're just not there yet kind of a thing. Like that's a response I feel like I get a lot. Why do you think that is? What in your mind, your experience, like why were you hesitant to do it? Like what prevented, like what were the hurdles in place, I guess, back
Yeah,
then?
yeah. And I would say even with this group that we have, right? If you're coming from delivery or for the sales folks that we have on, you probably think about it in your own, your own world, right? We all want to make repeatable process so that we can meet our expectations, right? And I think the truest sense, going back to what you said, Asa, of that bridge, that's where it's challenging, right? Because as much as you have that sine curve, you also have your salesperson who could be your CEO, right? Or it could be your VP of sales, or it could be, like the intern who's responding to an RFP. They're sitting there saying, I want to close this deal as quickly and efficiently as possible, right? I'm not going to do that by saying, well, hold on, I need more time to figure this out, or I'm gonna, we've got to do X, Y, and Z, right? They are incentivized to close that deal as efficiently and quickly as possible. On the delivery side, right, which is the world you and I came from, we're sitting there saying, no, hold on, we need a little more information here so that we can actually like start organizing this and we can actually deliver on what are we promising to deliver, right? And it is that sort of like, how are we going to find these connection points within our organization to have good communication? Who's going to update the deal, right? Like, all right, say you even have productized services. Whose responsibility is that? Is that the salesperson? What if they need an architect to come in and help out? Are they going to start doing it? Like, and it takes a lot of communication. It takes a bit of practice, I think. And it also, I think, takes like a shared understanding of that benefit. Because once you start seeing it at work, like for me, and I know we'll get to this, but like the aha moment to me is like, I'm never missing a sales call again. I'm going to go to all the VP of sales like calls. I'm going to haunt his like calendar and I'm going to invite myself. And, like he was like, oh, hey, Grant, good to see you. Like, we didn't have anything for you today. I was like, no, you did. You just don't know it yet. But I'm formulating all of these productized services. And like, it was a very manual effort to begin with. And it was only once I started engaging him in my first experience that he was like, oh, well, I can do that for you. I kind of have in my head what I think it should be. can we just meet weekly with like some of the other delivery leads? And then we'll just kind of confirm as like, oh God, like now we're setting our project management team up for success. All those delivery teams can go to their team members, but it's really hard to find, I think, one, the time, right? We're always busy. But then I think to have that architecture where we can have a meaningful conversation where I'm not impeding the salesperson and they're also setting delivery up for success. Those are really hard balancing acts to have. Austin, would you agree? Like you kind of you came from iOS and the Android world, right? Like two different, but like naturally lending themselves to service offerings in some way.
Yeah, 100%. Like we couldn't, well, what we were able to do, the fun part was like we got to a point where we knew while we were dealing with completely different teams, different languages, I couldn't bring my Android developers into my iOS developers' work. It was, they're just, I don't know, oil and water. But the fun part was we eventually got to the point, and that's what we're talking about now, that like we knew how we were going to approach that work was going to be the same generally, right? Like we knew how we were going to go about solving the problem for the client, even if it was two different platforms, it was one or the
Mhm.
other, it was just going to require different resources. But I knew early on the differences and I could plan for it that way, right? Like we could estimate out our time better. I could always tell which team was going to have more work versus less because we early on in our sales cycle, we could we do great. Let's take this package. Let's try we'll start here. And even if it changes, right? Even if the length extends or we shrink the size of the engagement or whatever, like we still directionally understand where we're headed and allowed us to have better conversations about, well, we know how much time it typically takes to do this stuff. We know it's easy for our sales team to go communicate that to the client, what they're going to get, how it's going to work. And then we could talk about when it could start. We could tell if we knew if we had the bandwidth to take it on and so forth.
Yeah.
Do you feel like so you recognize early on that like you have this problem, whether like someone prompted you or you just started to like figure it out, like this is the way to go. When the organization decides to actually like go through this process of like packaging these things up and bringing some repeatability into it, did you run into any challenges internally? Like were there people who would push back on you? Like did it take a while to convince people that it was time that it was necessary?
Oh yeah. 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 I mean, I think like it's one of my big passions is change management, right? Like changing people's minds. And you take that component in and of itself, and I think we could probably like do a call on it. But it like my experience, I was the second hire at the organization, and I was brought in to just try to save what was their biggest project, right? And it was this e-commerce system. And I came out of that like having learned a ton, but I also came out of that being like, guess what? Like I will do a lot better if I know what's expected of me from the sales conversations. And I think that was really challenging internally. I mean, there was only like by that point when we finished that project up and I was sort of doing this own retro in my own head of what would set me up for success for the future, let alone, we're trying to grow this team and all that. It's like, no, so like you need to involve me on that. But of course, what's the pushback, right? Like, well, no, that's why we have a sales department, right? Like let them hunt. You need to focus on delivery. Well, yeah, but if I know better, no, like you don't like it's very hard to know when those critical meetings are going to be happening, right? When are you really going to decide spec? What's going to inform the bandwidth of your team or a skill set you don't have that you might pick up on the delivery side or a salesperson may or may not pick up on the sales side that will inform a much greater process. And so, you're not going to catch everything. Tools have gotten better. We use Gong here, for example, so we can listen back at calls. But there still needs to be an expectation setting around, who's responsible for tracking this? What are those critical gates? And that can really vary and depend. I mean, your experience is very different from mine. I mean, I can imagine getting into a new marketplace. You got down a pat what my Apple Marketplace launch is going to be, how long that's going to take for that app to show up. I remember going through the first time and I was like looking around and the client was asking me like, how long will this take? When will it be in the market? And I was like, whenever Apple approves it, like, how am I supposed to know that? Like, Apple's $1 billion company. We're just like this small shop compared to them. And yet they looked at me like I was crazy. And I was crazy. I should have known that. But you learn this every time. And that was just another data point for me to bring back to like, okay, well, when we sell an iOS app, I got to tack on that like marketplace approval. And those can, without the right environment of a collaboration between teams, like that can be really hard. Even in the right environment, we're all, like I said, we're all working really hard. We're all trying to meet expectations, especially like knowing that I don't have a great sales bone and like in my body. I'm always like trying to be supportive of our salespeople because I admire so much what they do, like the confidence they bring every time. Like they've got to bring it. Like, because I mean, it's hard. It's hard to reinvent or it's hard to pivot when they're like, oh no, I'm going to change tech stacks. Like, what do you do? Like, I would just be like, oh, okay. Well, you don't even know what you want anymore. Like, see ya. And the sales, like a good salesperson gets excited about that. So I admire that a lot. And for me as a delivery person, like the way I bridged like some of those gaps was just to one, be present as much as I could, but two, support like our salespeople in that, right? Like my natural inclination is be like, well, you got to figure that out then, right? Like I need to set my team up for success and you're not helping me do that. And then I like the reality like I faced was, oh, like, no, I need to help him or her. And here's how I can do that. Like I can actually present a couple pivot options. And that still helps my team, right? Because it narrows down the number of paths we have going forward. But I mean, it's like you kind of have to look inside yourself, I feel like. But then you kind of have to find these like SLAs internally, like these agreements between teams, beg, borrow, whatever it is.
There's like
Would you
a,
agree? Like,
I think there's like, to me, it's like, in my experience, it was like finding commonality or just like how, like, on the delivery side, it's like, I need this because I need to understand what's coming, right? Like, I need to be able to plan for what am I being signed up for here? Like, it's really volatile to an organization when you're having to shift from all these different types of things. Like, people are depending on your size, people might be working on multiple projects, and like, the problem can be vastly different. Like the type of work you're doing can be so significantly different one project to the next if you don't have consistency in what it is that you do as a company and like how you approach and solve problems. And like that can be really disruptive. But I can't just in my like experience, it wasn't like you got to help me, like because this is my problem. Like finding like a I don't know the phrase for it, but like finding like the problem on the other side, like that they also experience that could be solved with the same thing. What I mean by that is like I've got this disruption problem to, delivering what you're selling. I think you have on the sales side like a challenge sometimes selling what it is that we're offering. Like there's a question in here I want to get to
yeah.
uh because I think it's relevant to this. It's like, clients aren't biting on, we're trying to sell audits and our clients aren't biting on it. Like how do we position this? And I felt like when we would work with sales to better, like it's all about what's the value that you're positioning in my experience, right? It's easier for sales if we are all on the same page with what it is that we're going to be doing, that it's less disruptive for me downstream and it's easier for sales to go sell it, right? Like we can practice and learn different ways of going to market. We talk about this all the time. We talked about it like an hour ago, you and I, Grant, the idea that like one of the best superpowers you have in this professional services space, right? The superpower agencies have is that every time you go to bat, every time you go to pitch, you get to completely reinvent yourself. Right? It's like you can go in and sell it completely differently, but like your approach is still going to be the same, right? Like how you're going to solve that problem is still the same, but how you talk about solving that problem can be different, right? That's the fun part of doing this job is that if one way of if you believe in the value of the thing that you're selling and you find that it is essential obviously to having good relationship with your clients and they're not understanding it, they're not biting it, you've got to iterate and try new things. Like we do that here at Parallax all the time, constantly changing the way that we talk about. We believe very intensely in this model, what we, how to run these businesses, that our software helps do that. But it's finding the way that people want to hear it. What resonates with them is certainly a hard part.
Yeah. And I would just say to that question around, clients aren't biting on our audits. To your point, I think part of that equation is what value do those audits bring and how do we define that? But the second piece too is, at least for us, like we ran into the same thing. and oftentimes around auditing of data, right? Because if a client's data was in better shape, guess what? Made our job way easier if you're engineering databases or multi-relationship elements. But then, what we do is, hey, we still sell the project through. And if they didn't want to do the audit first or a full discovery, in our case, we'd say, you know what, like, how about another statement of work, but we'll do like 40 to 60 hours of just data overage or cleanup. And if your audit's as good as you say it is from your internal standpoint, great. We won't even need that, right? We'll take you at your word. But like, we bet like there might be some things you're not aware of quite yet, or things will have to change in ways that maybe neither of us are anticipating. And it was a way to kind of create some partnership. We kind of made a game of it sometimes. Not everyone's up for that. But that was one approach that we had. And I would agree, Austin, on your kind of statement there. Like finding the value there and associates, it's not an audit for the audit's sake. It's how does it improve the customer's application, their operations, their own way of going about.
We're at what, 12:40? Okay.
Yeah.
So when I want to talk a little bit about like I guess like I want to talk about the sales and delivery side of things, right? Like I think we've I think we've talked a little bit about like, you know, these packaged productized services I think can help bring, you've used the word bridge. It creates some, symbiosis between both sides of the house, right? Like you're in lockstep on what it is that we're selling and how we're going to go about doing it for the most part, right? We're talking three horizons, right? Like 80% of the revenue for really high performing firms is coming from these productized services. Not all of it, right? You still have to be out searching and exploring and trying new things and coming up with new ways of doing it. Did your sales approach change, right? Like did you notice a difference, I guess, between like pre and post? Like was it Wild West and then everything calmed down and it was great? Or did it sales cycle, did they, the amount of time it took to sell something shrink? Like how did that
Yeah.
shift?
Yeah, it certainly there was changes. I think the realization going from the snowflake model and then, also adopting Parallax where we had our original deal value as well versus what our actual was, like that coincided quite a bit with this. But that process of saying like when everything's a snowflake, there was also far less accountability, right? Because it was a matter of getting a deal done and getting it across the line. And oftentimes it's very reactive. We have availability in the team. It's sell or die mentality, right? Like if you're not growing, what are you doing? And what the productized service offerings allowed us to do was benchmark and create, yeah, and sometimes like conflict points, right? Where it's like, why are we selling this below margin when we've got our bread and butter work over here? Because sometimes too, like we had to bring on contractors to do that stretch work, right? Or to do that AI work, figuratively speaking. Like those like are good conversation points, but like they also created a bit of tension. And some case it was negative. I mean, I'll say like that was hard when there wasn't alignment around, in particular, financials, because that was often what I was graded most against because COO, and we kind of had a fractional CFO that wasn't super engaged. And that was black and white for a lot of people. And yet the nuance of the business, the nuance of the sales team and who they're selling to is just doesn't always align. And if you don't have that right environment to be able to bridge, like to have those conversations, it can be very stressful. There's no doubt about it. That said, in a very similar situation, like to what you were in between iOS and Android, the next organization where I joined and we implemented Parallax, the service offerings like sold themselves, right? It was the business model. And the lack of friction that there's a delivery person and a salesperson that reported to me there. It was like a joy to be in those weekly meetings. It was like, why can't we do these more often? Right? Because it was just like problem solving, the right talent at the right time. And it was just immensely fun. And so it is very situational. I'm not going to say it's always, roses. It's not. But they're worthwhile conversations, especially when you're, a cash driven organization. You have to have tough conversations sometimes around where you're investing your time and is it for the right value. And I think there's a question around that first step of someone who's in ops but not in sales and delivery. And I think there are baselines there that you can look at in terms of, if we bring productized services, even if we look historically and try to productize our services, what are those expectations we should have had, margin wise, utilization wise, planning wise, where did they end up? And I think you could start making the case to say organizationally, we've got to start making better decisions around how we're planning our work and bridging sales and delivery, because it's not just a sales and delivery conversation. It's everybody in between. It's when you invoice, right? It's can be how you recognize revenue. It like doesn't really matter that it's primarily a sales and delivery motion, because it is affecting every part of your business, in my opinion.
Yeah. I want to actually answer both. There's a question, that one, what advice would you have as a
Mhm.
first step? And then what types of services are not suitable for productization, right? There's one in the chat. I'm going to actually put in the chat like this. We have a blog post on this thing. I'm just going to put it in here just so we have it. But like what I want to talk about with, or like in relation to both of those questions is like, you can audit, or excuse me, you can productize either the inputs or the outputs to the work, right? If you productize the outputs, what that means is like you gain, you're productizing like the deliverables, right? You're going to get 3 screens. We're going to build, X features. Totally fine, right? To a degree. But what you do when you start to productize your outputs is that you spend a lot of time up front then with the client negotiating on what those features are and how much each of those features is going to cost. And it's like, if you really knew everything you wanted, like, then why are we talking to each other? Just go, go find someone way cheaper to build this. Because that's what it opens up. That's the risk in doing something like that. I've got a bill of sale essentially, like, here's all the features I'm going to build for you, and here's what I'm going to charge you to do it. And then they can take that and go compare that to other offers essentially really easily. And you open yourself up to really heavy commoditization and price compression. That's the danger, right? Especially now when like globalization is way more prevalent than it ever has been, doesn't allow you to really, you're not really, I don't know. It's harder for you to scale and like grow that service, like what you're offering, because it's just so wholly dependent on like just developing features. However, if you can productize your inputs, and this is our personal philosophy, like this is the thing that we believe in the most, is like spend more time standardizing your methodologies, spend more time applying your principles to what it is that you do, the processes under which you go and solve problems for your clients, because that is what separates you from your competition, right? That is what makes you different. Lean into that, right? Like I was talking to a colleague last night and she was talking about how, she tries to help companies just like everyone on this call right now to identify yourself separately from your peers. And she pulled up, there are like 15 different companies around the college. She pulled up every one of their websites and like what they're like, they're who they are, right? Like what makes them different. And every website was basically the same and no one could tell which one was theirs. Like, because that's what makes it difficult. That's where these peaks and valleys come from, right? Like you'll get hot when the industry gets hot, you'll go cold with the rest of them. But when you have a unique perspective on how you go and solve problems, if you productize those inputs, think about that part. Like first step to me is thinking about what you do and how you do it. Not necessarily what you produce, like what spits out the other end, but how you go about understanding and applying your unique perspective to how your particular niche should function, packaging that and starting to sell that with your customers. Probably the easiest way to do it is through discovery sessions and things like that are pretty ubiquitous at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, to add to that, the lesson we learned, and that was really successful for us, was even I mentioned that first project I was on was a rescue project. Well, guess what? We productized that rescue project. We actually started targeting projects that had failed with other agencies, right? Or that weren't going well. And we could say, kind of, we're like, hey, we get what you're feeling. That must be really frustrating. And we've got a process to actually put this back on track. And we understood there was a value associated with that. And like, yeah, it was kind of based off of their fear of failure, right? Like, but we could go and bring a process, like help them feel like they were heard, that we could be trusted, and that they would ultimately get what they wanted. And that built relationships for us that became that first horizon, right? It would just very smooth work. 80% of our revenue came from like 8 of our customers, and we could grow that incrementally while exploring other avenues for growth as well.
I think Tom has told stories similar to that about growing the nerdery, where it was like, they had a huge project that they lost a ton of money on. It went really poorly. They made all the mistakes. And your probably immediate reaction is to ignore, well, let's never do that again. In his mind, he's like, well, wait a minute. We just learned all the mistakes, right? Like all the mistakes that every other person in this industry is going to make, we have already made. So we can go package that, turn that into a productized service and go sell it to everybody and be like, oh, have they thought about this thing that we screwed up?
Yeah, exactly it. That's exactly what we did. Yeah. And like we could, they would, it was almost like we were in their own heads, right? Like we often like, were you in that meeting? And it's like, the reality is we just had made the same mistake, right? But it's like, what we can now sell on that.
Right. That's okay. We have 9 minutes left. If there are any final questions, do pop them in and we'll get to them if we can. I don't know, I feel like we're at a good place to wrap. I think we, I don't know, I feel like we explored the space, Grant. I thought I had a good time. How was it for you? Was this as fulfilling as you thought it was going to be? Did this meet your expectations, Grant?
Yeah, like not coming from a sales background, productized services, right? Like I've really enjoyed it. And I think there's a found passion there that it's good to recall, right? Like be nostalgic and find that kind of energy. I would just say too, for anybody, if you're a current customer and if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd love to chat more, frankly. If you're somebody who doesn't use Parallax right now and you're just curious about this operation, please reach out, right? Same thing. I think Austin and I have a really deep passion for helping. I mean, in the same manner, like I made so many mistakes in my career, like, and yeah, I had really good people and team members that helped me out. Some of them I worked directly with, some of them who I've never worked with, but have became friends through the industry. And if I can pass that on in any way, I'd love to do so.
Yeah. Likewise. Alrighty. Well, appreciate everyone's time. Thank you for coming, listening to Grant and I talk at you for 53 minutes. Grant, been a wonderful guest. I hope you come back someday, even though I'll probably force you to since you work here and I can do that to you.
That's true. Yeah, you do. Thanks. Gave up the game,
All right.
everybody.
Adios.